potential entrepreneurs solve real problems for themselves. So in a sense, you say, well, this is ideal. It's a product and it's suited for a problem. The question then you have to answer is, how widespread is that problem? So now what you really are going out to do is validate not just the existence of the problem, but the extent to which it exists broadly. And it sounds like what you did was you began to explore, right? And you start to generalize from your success in different areas. So I don't think that's a bad way of doing it. Most, sort of lean startup advocates suggest that what you have to go out there and do is interview and talk with a lot of people. Would you see this as a solution? How would you use it? If so, what do we do? And where you get success, you double down in that area. And when you don't get success, you pull back from those efforts. And gradually, you are building a market that sort of reflects the problem that you experienced, but now you're beginning to learn how to describe the market of others who have the same issue.
And let me just add that we had a company called Demand Force that we invested in that ended up going after the small, medium-sized enterprise market, the same as you from a marketing standpoint. And they had, I should add that most venture capitalists think that going after that market is not good because the companies are too small so that you have trouble having a salesperson call in person to that company, and the owners are too busy to do phone sales, so you end up perhaps having to spend an inordinate amount on your sales. So the lesson I've learned from that experience, and it may be relevant to what you have ahead of you, is I think it's very exciting working with all these different types of potential customers. Just realize that you are one of the few that seems to have cracked the code, if you don't mind that expression, that figured out a way to make this work. And one of the things that worked for Demand Force, actually two different things, two different ways to look at it. One is they approached it from a vertical standpoint at a time. So in fact, and this was kind of boring to brag about as a venture capitalist, but it was very lucrative for the company, is they went after dentists first. So I had backed a company that was selling to dentists, and no offense to any dentists in the audience, but it just isn't the kind of thing you brag about to other venture capitalists that you're doing it. But then they went after auto repair, after dentists, and then they went after beauty salons. Just like you said, same idea, but slightly different product, slightly different vertical. And this is a classic strategy out of Jeffrey Moore's book, Crossing the Chasm. He calls it the bowling pin strategy. And he goes after these verticals one by one. So if you're not doing that, I'd encourage you to think about these verticals and, in fact, maybe even organize your company according to verticals. The other thing that Demand Force did that I was very impressed with, because I did do a little real work before I became a venture capitalist, and it was in the sales and marketing side. And it had been a while, though. And so what I was very impressed with is they created literally a sales machine. They did do their sales on the phone. I don't know if your sales are mostly by phone, but they still had someone have to visit maybe a customer once is what they tried to do, and then the rest of it was by phone. But they made their sales, they had the best organization, the best incentives. They really understood how to motivate their sales force. And this is an art. Companies that know how to motivate their sales force, it's hard, again, with due respect to the professors that teach this sort of thing, it's really hard to teach this. It's something that I've just seen CEOs and sales managers that are naturals on figure out how to do it. So I apologize, I can't tell you how to do it. I can just tell you what I saw is that the CEO spent a lot of time figuring out how do I configure my sales force, how do I incent them, because that turned out to be the toughest part of his business, but he made it successful, and he was able to grow his sales force, grow his customer base, ended up selling the company to Intuit for $500 million. So he really made a very successful ramp up in this business, and I commend you, because when a venture capitalist starts hearing 30% growth per month, we start saying, okay, how do I get a piece of this? Because that turns out to be some really interesting numbers when you hear those. So my hat's off to you.
Nice. Well, speaking of venture capitalists trying to get a part of your business, we heard Peter before talk about starting with family and friends as investors, but and then moving on and deciding what type of financing. I know that both Alex and Nikos, you've had great success. Nikos has had Open Fund Invest. You've had, I'm going to forget, Grayley Invest, which is fantastic success. In your case, you guys have had 2 rounds of financing with outside investors. So I was wondering, and I was curious, and I believe our audience would be, how did you get investors interested without necessarily having a track record of setting up companies? And at what point did you decide to go to outside investors in the business?
Should I go first? Okay. Yeah, that's. I think we've done all the steps prototypically with that. We started off by wanting to bootstrap it, so it's like family and friends. It's just no friends. It would be us. Not because we didn't have any friends, but because we wanted them to remain friends in the future. So the idea was that initially we're going to use our own money to do it. Then when we went to our bosses, we were working in the same company, said, we're going to quit and start our own startup. They said, no, don't do that. I said, no, yeah, we are going to do that. So in that case, why don't we give you some money? So we are partners in the new startup. So they did a small angel investing in the company. Yeah, that was lucky one. I don't know if it's good or bad, but we took the money. And then we said, okay, that's more than enough money that we're ever going to need. These 100,000, it's more than enough. 3 months later, we realized that, hey, we might be onto something here, so maybe get some more money. That's where Open Fund came in, and we raised another 600,000 euros. I can't say it was really hard at that time to raise money. I'm not saying it's super easy, but others have said it before. Like, if you have something going and it's working, there are a lot of people who are interested in looking at business like that, especially if you're in software, in tech. There's a lot of people saying that there's too much money on the table, actually, right now. And especially back then in Greece, there was a big change that happened. Like 10 years ago, it was impossible. But now the Open Fund and a few other funds do have a reasonable amount of money to give you, like a few 100,000 to start your business. So we took that, and then we grew, and then we ended up going to Greylock, and Greylock did the next round, and it's going to do the next one, which I can't tell you how much it is. Not yet. It's a weird world. It's a warped and very real world, the world of venture capitalists. It looks very weird to someone who's coming from outside and hasn't done it and just wants to run a business, until you start realizing their own economics, their own mathematics, what kind of company. Basically, they're trying to build companies that are going to be worth $500 million or $1 billion or more, especially due to the size of the funds, within 10 years, and they have to take a few amount of bets because they can't sit on too many boards. And this creates some perverse incentives where you go to an American investor and you say, I want to raise $5 million. He says, look, for $5 million, I'm not going to get into the plane and go to a board meeting. I would much rather give you $15 million. And it's a very weird world, and for someone who's an outsider like me, it's the first time I'm doing it, and to understand how it works and what kind of things they're looking for. But on the other hand, as an outsider, I would say that it is the triumph of capitalism. Like, it really is. It is the idea that people who have the capacity to create something of great value can do it regardless of whether they have money or not. And there's a fantastic system which is structured with all its flaws and all its annoyances and all of those terrible meetings. terrible meetings where you get to hear like really offensive stuff. But it does enable people, regardless of social status or background or anything, people have the skills to make something that adds a little bit of value to the world, to go and do it, and to do it safely with institutional mechanics that work. That's, however much I hate their meetings, that still amazes me.
And now you're taking their money and leaving.
Leaving, no. You're not going anywhere once you take their money.
Well, in fact, I had a question about Greylock, if I may, if this is okay. Did Greylock was comfortable investing in a company in Greece? Would they, if you, is that an okay question?
Yeah, yes. Actually, I thought that being in Greece would be a problem and that I would have to explain myself about it. And I thought that we would face, people looking at us with a bias. I don't think it's true.
Right.
At least in this world of tech venture capital, a lot of the traditional rules of business like this are out of the window. What matters is your numbers and whether you can really make the business work.
Yeah, I think that's the change I've seen in the last 5, maybe 10 years, is that change where they're looking at it as a global market. Venture capitalists, limited partners are all looking at it as a global market. So I think it really is to the advantage of the Greek entrepreneur, the Brazilian entrepreneur. I think we're seeing a definite trend that you should take advantage of.
And then there's car insurance. Not a sexy product, not a world domination play, not easy to find investors, the triumph of capitalism, not in Greece. So it took us a while. It took us about 1.5 years with Emilios to find the right type of investors. As I mentioned before, you need a minimum regulatory capital for the Bank of Greece or any regulator in Europe of about 6 million. So by definition, we had to raise more than that because we had burn as well. So our first round was 8.5 million euros. We did a top-up a few months ago of another 3.5. And we're now in discussions to raise some institutional funding, which will help us not in terms of money, but more in terms of credibility in the market. But to find that first 8.5 million was a bit of a journey for us. I think we were naive enough in the beginning, and that's a tip for any of you guys who is thinking of starting their own business to target Greece. We were naive enough to think that we would go to 5 shipping guys, and clearly they would see the obvious opportunity. They would recognize the degrees from Cambridge and Wharton and actuarial and all that, and they would say, of course, here's my money, here's 5 million from me, and take another 5 from another friend, and off we go. In reality, we found it hard to find Greek investors that were open enough to an idea that would disrupt a financial services industry play in Greece. We ended up finding foreign investors first. We had a private equity offer from London that we turned down. We ended up getting a combination of family offices who, as was mentioned before, were more generous to us at that point. I think the biggest challenge there is that very few people understand insurance, and very few people are comfortable enough investing in Greece. So getting a couple of local family offices from here, and we've been very fortunate in that regard to get a couple of good guys on board, and matching them with some international guys that have invested in insurance businesses before and fintech businesses before, that was the magic balance for us. But even there, you come into a market, you're competing against all these beasts, you need some big muscle behind you. So for us, it was actually quite a humbling experience in the beginning to set up with a limited budget. And then to reach out to institutions to team up with, which is something that I guess in the Silicon Valley, I don't know from your experience with insurance, I guess you start day one with institutions rather than family offices.
In fact, that was the experience. They actually, we had 3 venture capitalists come in at day one just because of the capital-intensive nature of the business. But one thing I want to mention that questions I get from my students or and friends that are entrepreneurs is, how do I find that particular investor? How do I know, or maybe they're not even savvy enough about the market to say, I need to figure out the right match of that investor. How do I figure that out? And that's where the internet is a wonderful thing. Most of the venture capitalists have a whole lot of information on their site that you may not think is relevant to you as an entrepreneur, but what they will do is list what sectors they're most interested in. Now you'll see a running blog by many of the VCs about them talking, and usually they talk about what they're interested in, areas they're attracted to. So for example, if I had an insurance company, which is a narrow niche for venture investors, so I think it's great that you were able to get investors that understood that niche, but I think you could systematically go through and look who backed Esurance. Let me look for those similar investors, or who backed this other insurance company startup. Let me look for those investors, or maybe I can look in a directory for that. But there's quite a bit of information out there. It may not be right in your face to say, I'm a venture capitalist, I only invest in these sectors at this stage with this amount of money. It may not be as obvious as that. But for those of you that are willing to work to get that information by digging, I think you'll find that that information, for the most part, is on just about every venture capitalist. And beyond that, there's databases, particularly if you have access to a university, there's extensive databases where you can do searches by sector. And so I would just encourage you, I find entrepreneurs somehow feel maybe they shouldn't or don't want to research their investor before they even have their first meeting. How often do I get a first meeting and they say, oh, I didn't realize you invested in this area? Well, that shouldn't happen. They should look me up before that first meeting. In fact, before they even make the appointment, they should look me up and say, oh yes, there's a good chance that he will invest in this because he invested in a similar company before. And I should add, look at that similar company before and determine whether it was a success or not, because I might have invested in insurance before and had just a terrible failure in that, and that's not going to be on my site. You'll be able to look at that company and do some research and say, oh yeah, you had a success in this area, and I have a similar area. So I just encourage you to do your research before you have that first meeting, because I think you'll be much more successful on raising capital, just as you ultimately were. And save that year that you spent.
Just to support you on that point, we approach people in a very almost military way. And I think for us, most of our cornerstone investors were cold calls that we didn't know before. We approach about 2,000 investors in total, having done our research, as you said. From those, we met about 300 of them face-to-face, and we ended up with 15 of them. The challenge you have when you're dealing with family offices as opposed to venture capital firms is that you don't have a database that tells you this guy likes this or this guy got burned in that, because it's all private information, especially in Europe. Something that Europe is missing, and maybe it's something for you guys or Stanford to think about down the line, is that across Europe there is a gap in growth capital. And companies like ourselves, especially in the financial services place, where you need a lot of capital and smart capital behind you, there is definitely a vacuum. You don't have the traditional growth players that you would get in the States, mostly because you have a lot of national barriers still, but there is definitely an opportunity for investors. But for us, we did exactly what you said. It still takes a while.
Okay. I can imagine.
Thank you. I'm a little conscious of time, so I'm going to look over and see if we have time for any questions. Okay, so I will open it up for questions. We'll take one or two, starting here, and then there, and then there, and then we'll stop. But we're waiting for the mic, or speak really loudly.
Hi, this is a question for Nikos. Nico, as you said, you actually chose a market where you thought it was your target market, which is small to medium-sized businesses. As you said, your perfect customer profile is dynamic. But when you actually decided to found a startup and you started here in Greece, your target market, as you said, is global. So you had a very limited sales force. In your customer engagement, customer development, and maybe customer success path chain, what were your main challenges that you met, and how were you able to overcome them? Mostly, I'm mostly interested in the customer engagement part. In other words, the marketing and the access to the potential customers.
Yeah, I mean, in the beginning, what you do is like you talk to every customer yourself, so you are customer success. So I started, since we had a little beta out, anyone who was willing to do a Skype call with me would get a Skype call with me. And I would go into a lot of detail. And you hear a lot of useless stuff in there, especially early on, you know, people who are tire kickers, who don't know what they want, it's a wrong thing. But you do hear a lot of interesting stuff as well. In our case, we came out with a product. Our ideas are, having worked in a company that had a big candidate flow, and it's also a feature of the Greek economy as well. If you're a successful company in Greece, you get a lot of people applying for it, is that make the best screening tool available. One that where you don't have to outsource the screening to someone else who doesn't know how to make decisions. So when we made that, and really, our software, you don't get any better in screening tools. It's the best in the market. We were wondering, like, why aren't people using it like crazy? So we realized that the most American businesses, they expected the software like that to also connect to the sources where they bring the candidates in. People told us that I want to click a button and see the candidates flowing in, because they perceive hiring mostly as a job posting service. Now, we heard that, and then we started looking at the numbers and realized that the very few people that were actually using, buying, whatever, were the people that had more than 10 candidates in a while because somebody uploaded this and that. So by talking to customers and hearing that feedback and looking at the numbers make sense to you. And then we said, right, we're going to connect to every source there is about that, and then the business started taking off. So I don't know if I'm covering it, but in the beginning, you do things not like a company. You're an individual. You have your little thing over there, and you're showing it to people, and you try to understand what are they making out of it, what terms are they using to describe it, etc. And that's the only way you can figure it out.
Great. We're going to take one more question,
Okay.
and then we're going to go to cocktails. And our speakers will be joining us at the cocktail, as will our professors, so you can also ask them questions there. I've already said, oh.
Yes, it is a brief one, a one-word one, name. Throughout our evening session here or afternoon session, we didn't hear the word name. Does name matter? I would expect that for companies who target
Sorry,
consumers.
can you repeat that? The word what?
Name. Name, not brand, name. Does name matter when you form your company, especially when you're going to target consumers? Is this a concern? Does it have an impact factor? I mean, who decides the name? I mean, what's going on there?
Can go serious? and
Well,
then
no,
funny.
oh, go ahead.
Well, I meant professors.
Are
Respect.
we serious? I didn't know whether I was funny or serious. But no, the quick answer is I don't think, my belief is the name does not matter, okay? I think as long as it doesn't conflict and confuse the customer, it turns out the entrepreneur does spend a lot of time, the CEO will spend a lot of time, she or he, to try to figure out the name. And what I encourage them to do is first understand the name may change, and it's hard to believe this, but so many companies we've backed, the more successful they are, the more likely they're going to change their name as they get larger. And so the name you start out with is not necessarily the name that you end up with after your second year. It just happens, is what I can tell. The second is that I really don't think personally that it matters that much. It's really about the product and the team and the passion that you have, and the name is really tertiary. It's at the end of the list.
I think we are being asked to step out the cocktails given the sudden brightness of the room. I think we have one closing statement. Thank you all.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ, thank you. Δεν έχω πολλά άλλα να σας πω, πέραν το ότι και αυτό, όπως είπα στην αρχή, είναι ένα startup. Ευελπιστούμε και σε άλλες τέτοιες βραδιές. Ελπίζουμε να ευχαριστηθήκατε την απόψινή μας εκδήλωση. Έχουμε το Facebook group μας. Ήταν αρκετά δύσκολο να επικοινωνήσουμε όλη αυτή την εκδήλωση με πολλούς ανθρώπους που βοήθησαν. Σας ενθαρρύνουμε να κάνετε like, να γίνετε φίλοι μας, ώστε την επόμενη φορά να έχουμε και ακόμα περισσότερα άτομα κοντά μας. Σας ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Ως την επόμενη φορά. Γεια σας.